Hi everyone, welcome to this presentation of Gold Standard for the Global Goals. My name's Owen Hewlett and I'm the Chief Technical Officer of the Gold Standard Foundation, and I'm joined by my colleague Sarah Lugers, our Director of Marketing and Communications. I'm going to give an overview of the standard, the certification pathways, documentation, project cycle and key features, and Sarah will provide an overview of our new claims guide and how the certification by Gold Standard can be used to make certain claims in certain contexts. Our consultation is open at the website, the link is on this slide, and we recommend viewing this video before diving into the detail, and we'd certainly love to hear your views via the platform provided. So I'm going to start by talking about the certification pathways in Gold Standard for the Global Goals. As you'll know by now, one of the key principles and aspirations of the new standard is to provide developers with greater flexibility and choice of what to certify and what to issue. For the first time, projects can achieve Gold Standard certified project status but are no longer compelled to issue carbon credits or other products unless they choose to. So really in the new standard, there are three key certification statuses that are available. The first two are mandatory in that all projects must achieve them to remain Gold Standard certified, and the third is optional depending on which pathway you're seeking. So just taking those three in turn there left to right, the first step would be Gold Standard certified project design. This means that upfront or ex ante, your design is demonstrated as meeting the Gold Standard requirements. This does not mean they've been achieved, it simply means that your design is such and has gone through a process as such that the impacts that you propose to make can realistically be achieved. The step is similar to what was previously known as registration or becoming a registered project, in that it involves the upfront review by a third party under validation and a further review by Gold Standard. The second milestone in the middle is Gold Standard certified project status. This means that the project has progressed to implementation and has been verified by a third party and reviewed by Gold Standard in order to achieve this status. This is mandatory. Projects will not be allowed to remain at Gold Standard certified project design status, but rather must move on to Gold Standard certified project status through verification and certification. But for the first time, that's as far as project developers can choose to go. So in previous iterations of Gold Standard, project developers were compelled to issue carbon credits or water benefit certificates. In Gold Standard for the Global Goals, it's perfectly acceptable to become a Gold Standard certified project and for that to be the value that you were seeking. But then the third option is on the right-hand side here in the grey box, Gold Standard certified impacts. This is really optional, and it's for project developers that are choosing to follow a results-based finance pathway or seeking to issue, say, carbon credits. And you'd achieve that by becoming a Gold Standard certified project, but also following a Gold Standard approved methodology and product specification. For example, an emissions reduction methodology and the rules and requirements concerning Gold Standard VERs. Those projects seeking Gold Standard certified impact would also be required to prove financial additionality or additionality in a market sense. This step is not mandatory. So projects, as I say, can choose to stop at Gold Standard certified project status and may choose to issue products and statements. That's a little easier to understand with a worked example, and I've chosen here renewable energy projects to show the pathway and the documentation involved. All projects shall conform to the Gold Standard for the Global Goals requirements, the first box there on the left-hand side, and that's what's out to public consultation right now on our website. In addition, all projects shall conform to activity requirements for their specific activity type. In the renewable energy context, I've chosen an example here of Annex C of version 2.2 for those that know it, which contains certain eligibility criteria and requirements for things like large hydro projects. So mandatory for all projects, regardless of what pathway you're seeking, shall be the conformity to Gold Standard for the Global Goals requirements and to any specific activity requirements related to your project type. And then secondly, as an option, projects can choose to issue Gold Standard certified SDG impact statements or Gold Standard certified products such as carbon credits, and that's the example I've chosen here. So the two right-hand boxes are optional in this project pathway. A project could choose to finish its certification at Gold Standard certified project status, which would just involve those two mandatory boxes. But in this case, our project has chosen to issue carbon credits and therefore must follow the gold standard approved emissions reduction methodologies for renewable energy, in this case the CDM methodologies that we recognise, and follow the gold standard VER and CER product specification, and prove its financial additionality. By following those elements, the project becomes a gold standard certified project with the mandatory boxes and is then able to issue carbon credits. So how does that look in terms of documentation? Well, the mandatory documentation there on the left-hand side concerns the gold standard for the global goals requirements in the left-hand side box, which contains things like the core eligibility criteria and the safeguards. And the second box there is the activity requirements I just mentioned, where you'll find specific eligibility criteria and how to apply some of the safeguards, for example, in that context. And those are the mandatory steps for all projects. Then the right-hand boxes, the two right-hand boxes, methodology and product specifications, are the optional ones. And in those you'd expect to find the details of how to quantify a given impact in the methodology, and in the product specification, the rules around issuing that product. And as I say, those are really optional depending on how you structure your certification pathway. The project workflow for Gold Standard for the Global Goals is inspired by our earlier iterations, but has changed somewhat. This is a slightly busy slide, but is repeated in the standard, and you can read it in more detail there. Briefly though, to take you through some of the details of it, the same ex-ante, ex-post system applies. Projects will achieve project design certification, similar to registration, and then go on to monitor their project and report and certify under Gold Standard ex-post on the real impacts that occurred. So working from left to right, a project will be, the initial project inception will take place, led by the project developer, who will conduct a stakeholder consultation and submit that for preliminary review to Gold Standard. Preliminary review is an opportunity to iron out any major creases and is similar to our listing step in version 2.2. The preliminary review decision complete by Gold Standard leads to listed status and allows the project to appoint a Gold Standard validation and verification body, or an auditor in old language, and they would conduct a validation exercise. That validation opinion is submitted to Gold Standard for project design review, which is a 6-week period, same as our existing approach, and that leads to project design certification if successful. And just a note there at the top that there's a maximum of 2 years between when you're listed and when you achieve project design certification. Then moving to ex-post, there's a couple of new features. Every year a project must report, provide an annual report to its stakeholders. This is not a certified report, but rather provides details of any major events, stakeholder feedback or changes in the project, and is designed for transparency. But as I say, not a certification step. Annual reports are not required on years where a verification takes place. So you can see there in this example, in the imaginary example, that an annual report is not required in year 2 because a verification is taking place, but is required in year 1 and year 3. And then in terms of monitoring, reporting and verification, very similar to our existing model, the project must verify within the first 2 years of having its project design certified. And it follows a very similar process to that which you'll be familiar. The project developer appoints GS validation and verification body, an auditor, who conducts a verification, provides that opinion to Gold Standard, who conduct a performance review, which is 3 weeks. And the result of that is really the performance certification of the project. That leads to Gold Standard certified project design status, thinking back to the earlier slide. That also allows projects to issue products and statements at the same time. So for example, if that monitoring period has followed a methodology and a product specification, then by achieving performance certification, you may issue those products and statements as required. And then the last feature there on the right hand side is that the cycle is now a 5-year cycle, so changing from 7 and 10 to a fixed 5-year cycle, which is renewable. So all projects will now be on a 5-year cycle and may choose to renew at year 5, and that renewal will follow a similar process to project design certification, but will focus on any changes to the project design and assumptions that underpin that, and specifically review the project baseline. And if you are seeking products and statements, will also review the financial need of the project. I'll come back into that into a little bit more detail in a future slide. So just summarising those key points and the key changes, I think the biggest one is that the certification cycle is now based on a 5-year system, and the rationale for that is to reflect and mirror the Paris Agreement timelines, which are also on a 5-year cycle. So not trying to align with the 5-year reporting date per se, but at least the 5-year timescale for decision making that's embedded within the Paris Agreement. The project becomes a certified project design first, similar to registration, and then has 2 years to carry out performance certification and become a gold standard certified project. The project can do that as many times as it chooses to do during the 5-year cycle, but must do that first one within the first 2 years. And then at year 5, update the baseline and prove ongoing financial need allows you to renew your certification and continue. And then lastly, the new feature, which some of you in the land use sector will be familiar with, is the requirement to publish annual reports, although these aren't certified. So how does the standard work? Well, the standard is now structured around key principles, 5 core key principles, which really explain clearly what the standard is trying to achieve and what gold standard is about from a technical perspective. And those 5 principles are: Principle 1, the project must contribute to climate security and sustainable development. And it does that by being an eligible project type. It does it by defining its baseline and project scenarios, and it does it by demonstrating 3 SDG contributions, 3 contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals. And one of those contributions must be SDG 13, which concerns concerns climate mitigation and adaptation. And that first principle really reflects our requirement, or our mission, if you like, of climate security and sustainable development for all. Just a note on the eligible project types, we are fully expecting that any project type that's currently eligible within Gold Standard will be transitioned to Gold Standard for the global goals, and we'll be producing activity guidance to go with each of those. It's also going to be possible to submit new activity types to Gold Standard, and there's a process within the standard for that which you can read and comment on. The second and third principles are really about making sure that the positive contributions of the project are well considered and delivered robustly and properly thought through. So the second principle, safeguarding, really is a series of principles that govern the level of negative impact that a project may make, or the restrictions on a project from a safeguarding perspective. So, for example, there are restrictions on the use of child labour, as you'd expect, anti-corruption measures, and some environmental matters such as water, energy, and land use. Then the third principle, stakeholder inclusivity. The project design and implementation must include stakeholders. This is probably the least changed aspect of the standard, and it involves the requirement to carry out a stakeholder consultation and include the feedback in the project design, and to implement a feedback and grievance mechanism and report upon that. The fourth principle is about demonstrating that the outcomes of the project are real. That requires projects to produce a project design that includes a monitoring plan. It requires projects to undergo design certification and performance certification, and if requested and needed by the project, to renew every 5 years. So really this principle really emphasizes that all projects must undergo MRV. There's no project that can end at project design certification. All projects must undergo MRV under Gold Standard, echoing our earlier principles. And then lastly, principle 5 is around financial additionality and financial need, and this is a principle that serves projects that are seeking result-based finance mechanisms from Gold Standard. So for example, Gold Standard certified SDG impact statements, or Gold Standard certified products such as carbon credits or water benefit certificates. And for those projects, ex-ante financial additionality must be proven, and here we'll provide various tools and guidance and deemed additionality terms for different activity types, and where those exist currently within our existing standards, they'll largely be transferred to the new standard. And then at 5-year renewal, all projects seeking that kind of mechanism must now prove ongoing financial need, so ex post financial need based on real financial receipts. I'll come on to that in a little bit more detail shortly. So how do the principles work? Taking each in turn very briefly. Principle 1, contribution to climate security and sustainable development. Well, all project types, seeking certification must be of an eligible type, and all of the types that are currently eligible in version 2.2 or land use or water benefits will continue to be eligible under gold standard for the global goals. And as I mentioned earlier, there will be a process for bringing new project types to the standard as well. Then all projects must demonstrate 3 SDG contributions, and they do this with one of 3 pathway options. So it's a minimum 3, remember, as many as you like, but a minimum of 3. And the 3 options for demonstrating that contribution, the first is the base or default option, and is similar to what you'll be familiar with from version 2.2. And here the developer is required to select an indicator and justify how that indicator is a reasonable proxy for a positive influence on an SDG. The second pathway is to use a gold standard approved tool, SDG tool, and these could be third-party recognized or could be authored by gold standard, and we propose to develop those over the coming years. And what we aspire to do here is create a tool for each activity type that really provides an overview of all of the SDG contributions of a given activity type. So not just 3, but perhaps 6, 7, 8 in a simple, meaningful way for your project type to report. And then lastly, the third way of demonstrating an SDG contribution is to follow a gold standard approved methodology and or product specification. And that pathway really is for those projects seeking products and statements for results-based finance, as we talked about earlier. And then lastly, a new feature is that projects must appoint an independent expert stakeholder to advise on certain SDG contributions. And this is really where the links are a little less obvious, or the science isn't particularly strong, or the contribution isn't definitely going to be realized. And those are pre-identified, will be pre-identified in the activity requirements. So it'll be very clear when and where an expert stakeholder's advice is required. The rationale for that requirement is to add extra credibility to those claims that are perhaps somewhat weaker in scientific terms, and to provide greater credibility and integrity to both the project and the standard. I would stress, though, in most cases, an expert stakeholder won't be required. It's in certain cases, certain activity and SDG requirement combinations, it'll be required. Principle 2, the safeguarding principles. All projects will undergo a safeguarding principles assessment, and that involves answering a series of questions to determine which requirements apply to the project. There are quite a lot of questions and quite a lot of requirements, but we would stress that not all of those will apply to all project types. Some will be answered no, for example, and can be simply ignored, and some are deemed mandatory. And the idea here is that for each activity type at launch, there'll be a pre-filtered list that supports the project developer and makes clear which requirements are mandatory, which can be left unanswered or undemonstrated or unproven with a justification. So you might be able to say that this safeguarding requirement was relevant, but it's not relevant to my specific context because of a certain reason. And then lastly, which of those requirements can be ignored with no justification. So for example, a safeguard that's simply not relevant to your activity type. So the idea here, the rationale, is that all safeguards are applicable to all projects, but there will be a pre-filtered list that allows you to disregard certain ones. And then again, expert stakeholders are required for more challenging topics. So for example, if you're involved with Indigenous peoples, we'll require that an expert stakeholder gives you advice on that. There's not a huge amount of those, and they're really there, again, I would stress, to assist with credibility in the more sensitive issues. Principle 3, stakeholder inclusivity, is the one that will be most familiar to people. Not a huge amount of change in the way our stakeholder works following the last consultation round on the standard. Here you'll be required to conduct a consultation and a feedback round and incorporate that in your project design. And as before, implement a feedback and grievance mechanism. And the guidance also includes a little bit more detail on expert stakeholders, as I mentioned. Probably the biggest change to the stakeholder requirements are they now require the consideration of relevant stakeholders, whereas previously it focused on local stakeholders. And the rationale there is that for some of our bigger project types, for example, in cities or major water-based projects, the stakeholders may not be local. You may have somebody affected downstream, for example, particularly if you're thinking of, say, water usage. And so we've created the term relevant stakeholders, which involves local, affected, and interested. to really expand on that. And again, it's about adding credibility. Principle 4, we've been through in some detail already. This is really the certification cycle and how to demonstrate real impacts. And so I won't go over this again in too much detail other than to say that the process involves the creation of a monitoring plan and then conducting MRV upon that. And then lastly, Principle 5, financial additionality. So this is a topic that's dear to the heart of many in the carbon markets, but is going to be somewhat new in other new marketplaces that Gold Standard is seeking to serve. This is an optional principle. This is a principle for projects that are seeking certified outcome statements or products for financial gain. So where there's a need, such as for carbon credits or carbon finance to support the project in order to make it viable, then financial additionality applies. There are two parts to financial additionality within Gold Standard for the global goals. The first is ex-ante additionality demonstration within the project design. So as many of you will be familiar with, following various additionality tools or deemed additionality requirements, a project will prove its financial additionality in project design certification, just as it did in registration in previous versions. But then there's a newly introduced requirement, which is called ongoing financial need. So at the 5-year renewal, projects will prove that they still require finance to be viable. And that will be based on real financial receipts. And of course, those will be kept confidential and not published because, in nearly all cases, I would imagine they will be sensitive to the project developer. But that'll be based on real evidence. And we've introduced that for credibility reasons and to ensure that finance is going to the place it's most needed, and the projects that have, or particular project types that have become additional during the 5-year cycle, are not able to continue to claim and divert climate finance from other projects that really need it. So really trying to stay on top of that changing dynamic of additionality within the various project types and marketplaces we serve. I would stress there again that individual activity requirements, so if you're a renewable energy project or a cook stove project, then there will be clarity on what additionality is deemed already. So for example, our LDC rules, and whether or not you need to prove it at 5 years or the second one at 10 years, for example. So there'll be deemed additionality and there will be automatic renewals for a certain period for certain project types, but that'll be captured in activity requirements in a future release. So I provided an overview of the certification pathways and document structure and the new certification flow of Gold Standard. And it's clear that that's an evolution of Gold Standard's approach, and that there are some compelling changes that project developers should be aware of that add both credibility and integrity to the system. And I've taken you through the 5 core principles of the new standard and again explained what's been changed and what's been updated from previous versions, and a little bit of the rationale behind that. And on that note, I'll stop there and hand over to my colleague Sarah Lugers, who will take you through the claims guide.
Thanks, Owen, and hello, everyone. As Owen mentioned, I'm Sarah Lugers, Director of Communications for Gold Standard. Now that Owen has highlighted the new technical developments of Gold Standard for the Global Goals, I'm going to introduce the new claims guidelines that are out for public consultation alongside it. Before I do that, it's worth spending just a moment on the drivers and the rationale for this new standard and its associated claims. As you know, Gold Standard has always stood for bringing development impacts to climate interventions. In early 2015, we formalized this with a new vision statement: climate security and sustainable development for all. And the way we work to achieve this vision is based on the premise that sustainable development can be a lever for more ambitious climate action, that maximizing and quantifying the development impacts of, for example, a carbon reduction project can help increase recognition and stakeholder support for that intervention, leading to a virtuous circle of positive impact. With this foundation, we looked at the internal and the external forces that would have implications for our existing standards. The first came at the end of 2015, which was really a validation of our direction, when the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted in September, and in December, the momentous Paris Agreement demonstrated that climate and development indeed are inexorably linked, and that our standard had to serve both agendas equally. Specific to the Paris Agreement, we needed to make sure that our standard, our projects, and our stakeholders were positioned for success in this new paradigm, in the new post-Paris world order. And there are several implications of the Paris Agreement on the gold standard, our projects, and our stakeholders. The first is that every country has a cap, which fundamentally challenges, or at a minimum complicates, the concept of offsetting. However, there's a huge opportunity in the fact that there's a big gap left by the national determined contributions, the NDCs, that fall well short of the well below 2-degree target. And the Paris Agreement also calls for strong contributions from the private sector and underscores the need for climate finance. And finally, the Paris Agreement mentions more than 30 times the need for sustainable development to be at the core of climate action. So with this, we understood that our standard needed to reflect both the Paris Agreement and the SDGs. At the same time, internally, there were some forces that required a revision to our standard. The standard had expanded over time, starting with the energy scope initially, introducing a land use and forest standard in 2012, and then a water benefit standard in 2014. This introduced different requirements and different processes that we felt we should reconcile and make consistent across our standards. And finally, we wanted to respond to stakeholder requests that through these new standards, there was a desire to issue multiple impacts and to monetize those impacts in a given intervention. And the spirit of continuous improvement has always been an operating philosophy of Gold Standard. In fact, we see a mark of success as seeing our innovations adopted by, for instance, the CDM and other standards. So, since some of our innovations around sustainable development had become common practice, we challenged ourselves to raise the bar to see how can we increase ambition and accomplish more. And that really led to Gold Standard for the Global Goals, a true integration of the climate and development agendas in a holistic way to quantify and certify impacts to the Sustainable Development Goals and to contribute to climate security. So what implications does this have on claims? What new opportunities do project developers have under Gold Standard for the Global Goals? The first I just mentioned, which is the flexibility to issue and sell multiple impacts from a single intervention, for instance, gender, water, and health. In addition, projects may choose to achieve only activity level certification if they choose not to pursue any monetization of impacts using results-based finance instruments. In addition, in the spirit of continuous improvement, we've enhanced the safeguards such that every project under Gold Standard for the Global Goals may claim to be water aware and gender aware. We're also developing a new designation, which we're calling for the moment a pro-poor flag, to designate those projects that are serving most vulnerable communities. And some of the new products that will be available for results-based payments include renewable energy certificate labels to demonstrate sustainable development impacts and additionality in the REC space. Health impacts using the metric of averted disability adjusted life years, which is a common metric to demonstrate the reduced burden of disease in the health community. Gender outcomes and adaptation outcomes, which will be defined and shared in due course. So when reviewing these new claims guidelines, it's helpful to understand the guiding principles that went to inform the guidelines as you see them in consultation. The first is to honor every impact and to allow projects to appropriately distinguish themselves and value the transformational impacts that they're delivering. The second is to make sure that we maintain and enhance, when possible, the credibility and transparency of claims around Gold Standard for the Global Goals, as we expand our scope and potentially introduce multiple funders into a given intervention, it's very important that we protect our stakeholders, both project developers and funders, from accusations of greenwashing or development washing, SDG washing. And in the same spirit, we're making sure that our claims guidelines are compatible with ICEAL requirements as we pursue full ICEAL membership. We also want to make sure we take this opportunity to ensure that claims and general language around gold standard for the global goals is very accessible to common people who are not, for instance, in depth with the carbon markets. We want to break the bonds of terms like additionality and be very clear about what different claims mean, what different levels of product certification mean, and what the associated impact claims that go along with these. And of course, we want to make sure that the claims that we're providing are interesting to new funders and consistent with their needs. So that was the final lens through which we evaluated our claims guidelines. Let's take a look at an example. If a project developer sought to roll out an improved cook stove activity, they would follow Gold Standard for the Global Goals, the base code, in addition to the activity level requirements for cook stove activities. Having demonstrated that they had followed all the relevant safeguards, consulted with affected stakeholders, and verified that their estimated contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals were realistic and achievable, they would achieve certified project design status. And that could help them in securing investment by demonstrating that they'd followed best practice, were positioned to deliver on their ex-ante SDG contributions. Following performance certification, the project would then be able to claim certified cook stove project status and could be able to claim verified contributions to the SDGs, such that you see here. Now, if that project also sought additional finance and wanted to monetize additional impacts, they would also follow a financial needs assessment to demonstrate what's known as additionality in the carbon world. They would apply the relevant methodologies necessary in order to issue the products that they were interested in. In this case, we see a carbon reduction methodology, gender, as well as the A-Dailies methodology. And by undergoing performance certification, would be able to claim gold standard certified SDG impacts, at which time the relevant products would be issued, in this case, VERs, A-Dailies, and an impact statement capturing the benefits related to gender. And they would have to follow the product specifications and claims related to each of those products. I'd now like to introduce a few elements that were developed in support of the guiding principles of credibility and transparency. The first seen here is an effort to protect projects and funders from any risks or accusations of overclaiming, and the first is specific to health. Any health-related claims will require expert stakeholder input and clear academic justification. So in the absence of this and or applying the A-Dailies methodology, we have standardized a new SDG contribution claim around clean cooking and heating technologies. And that is that many improved cook stoves are associated with reduced smoke, which can lessen exposure to dangerous indoor air pollution. The second level is related more to funders, which is that when a VER or CER buyer communicates around their purchase or support of a project, they need to specify the volumes in tons and the percentage that these represent within their total buy. And finally, specific to Gold Standard certified SDG impacts, these will all be tracked and reported and publicly available in the Gold Standard Registry. Let's now step through the fundamentals of an impact statement that will be issued to a project following performance certification. We're introducing standardized language that allows projects to communicate about what they have achieved following performance certification. These include, of course, stakeholder inclusion, contributions to the SDGs, and the water-aware and gender-aware claims that I talked about earlier, as well as transparency and civil society support. And you'll see further context around this in the claims guidelines themselves. And then there will also be standard language around what it means to have followed the additional activity level requirements, such that you see here. The next major component of an impact statement will capture the SDG contributions, formerly known as co-benefits. And this will happen much like it is done today. Projects are very much encouraged to communicate about what SDG contributions they have certified as at the project narrative level. When we look at monetized impacts, we will detail the gold standard certified SDG impacts one by one. And you'll see here an example of SDG 13 climate action. This project will have issued VERs. We'll specify the methodology that was applied, as you see here. We will specify which SDG target this contributes to, also specify the volumes, have a very clear link back to the registry to enhance transparency, and we'll cite the actual serial numbers again for transparency and tracking purposes. Here you see health as a second example using the A-Dailies methodology, and it's worth noting here that these impact statements will also have guidelines for funder claims that will very much mirror what you see here, and that is a clear specification of the methodology that was followed, the SDG target it contributed to, the volumes that were supported, and a link and a direct connection to that tracking on our public registry. That concludes the highlights of the claims guidelines that are out for public consultation along Gold Standard for the Global Goals. You'll see here my contact information as well as Owen's. We, on behalf of the full Gold Standard organization, thank you for your engagement and your support, and we encourage you to provide us with your feedback via the public consultation, and welcome any comments that you may have to improve the standard and prepare it for launch in June 2017.